Market this morning. I'm telling you, as I just watch what God is doing, I am so excited about what God is doing here at West Market, and it's because of difference makers. It's because of people who invest in the work that God's doing here. It's because you got an amazing staff. I mean, the whole everything right here, right now is it's a special moment in what God is doing, and so I'm just so excited about what God is doing. I'm also excited about the nice accoutrements here that when you speak here that you get a little comic strip. I thought that was cool. It says, if you must shout during my sermons, please make it amen instead of touche. So there's that. And I've got little mints and stuff. And so it's just kind of like, I feel like I'm in a 5-star hotel pretty much. So it's pretty awesome. So thank you for... Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, we've been working our way through these acceptable sins, talking about things that we kind of, unfortunately, don't see as a real big deal, right? Like, let's just be honest, like, especially Christians, we kind of have those sins on our list that we're like, the ones that eyebrows go up when people say them. Those kind of things. And then we got the ones where it's like, everybody kind of deals with that. And unfortunately, we don't see these as a really, really big deal. And that's sad. And it's kind of actually a little bit of deception by the enemy because every sin affects our relationship with God. So, like, God really wants us to take these things seriously. And the thing that we're talking about today, Jesus actually says it's the number one thing vying for our allegiance over God. And so it's pretty serious, actually. And maybe Jesus was so concerned about this because he knows the damage it can do, right? That it can break up marriages, that it can break up friendships, that we can literally burn ourselves out, that it can make us really ungrateful and unhappy. It can literally put people in prison. It can drive people deep in debt. And so we're talking about greed today. And that one's, that's a lot of fun. Like, yay, greed. Everybody's excited about that this morning. But I think this is one that we have a really hard time seeing in ourselves, right? Because it always masquerades with some great motivations, right? Well, I just need to provide for my family. I just want to plan ahead for whatever might be coming up. I want my kids to have a better situation than what I had. And so it just always kind of feels like that we're just doing things that make sense, right? And that's why I love this quote by Johnny Bird from a couple of weeks ago. Johnny Bird is our Springbrook campus pastor. And so he said this, just that greed likes to sneak into the planning meeting. And it's like, yeah. That's true, right? Like what happens is we start out just saying, well, I got to figure this out. I need to make sure I'm planning well. I need to think this through. I need to be smart about this. And then all of a sudden, greed just kind of steps in and takes over the meeting, right? And then at some point, like the conversations become, well, we need a little bit more before we could bless somebody else. And I kind of am losing my spirit of gratitude and faith. And I feel like that we don't quite have enough yet. And we need to focus on ourselves first, and we think, well, that's just making sense, right? We're just having a planning meeting here. Just makes sense. And all of a sudden, the conversation shifts from God being our security and what we're trusting in to possessions and money being our security and what we're trusting in. And we don't really realize that the meeting got taken over. We don't even realize that it happened. And I think it's also hard for us to see because of the culture that we live in, right? I mean, the American dream is like, it's a good thing, in a sense, the fact that people can work hard and become what they want to become and get where they want to get, that kind of stuff. Like, there's some positives to it, but also, let's just be honest, like it also, there's a lot of peer pressure in America with this concept of the American dream to achieve certain things and to be certain things and to have certain things, and it just kind of never lets up on us. And because of that, it just kind of feels like everybody else is living that way. So why shouldn't I live that way as well? I heard one person say it this way, that you have a problem with greed if you never feel like you have anything extra. And I thought, no, that means you have a problem with income. But no. What they're saying is, no, you have a problem with greed because what happens is when you have an issue with greed, you continue just to focus on this concept that I need to have more, right? I need more. And so therefore, we have this assumption that it's all for us. And really, that's what greed is. And so if I could give you a definition this morning, it would just be this. Greed is the assumption that it's all for your consumption. And so that's what we focus on, that it's all for me. And because of that, we live in a way that runs all the money out before the month runs out. And so we never feel like we have extra. And so it's greed that makes us feel that way. And again, the American dream's been this way for a long time, right? Like John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon, was asked how much is enough? And he answered, and some of you know the answer, just a little bit more, right? It's always just a little bit more. And so we have this assumption that it's all for our consumption. I just need a little bit more. If I just get here, then I can start focusing on something else, or I can focus on other people. And we end up just being driven by our wants and driven by our desires. And before long, basically money is controlling us instead of us controlling our money. And here's the thing. This is why Jesus cares so much about this issue. It's not that God wants your money so much as it is that God doesn't want your money to have you. That's why he cares so much about it. And frankly, God is pretty jealous about what it is that is controlling you. That's why he says in Matthew 6:24, he says, no one can serve two masters. He says, either you're going to hate the one and love the other, or you're going to be devoted to the one and despise the other. He says, you can't serve God and money. Like, what? God and money. Like, he could have picked anything. Right? I mean, our culture is driven by desires for all kinds of things. And frankly, I mean, to me, the antithesis of God would be the devil. Why not that, right? Why does it have to be money? And Jesus says the number one thing that is vying for our allegiance that should be going to God is money. And that is why Jesus gives this amazing picture of what it looks like to struggle with greed in Luke chapter 12. And I love this interaction. Jesus is just teaching along, and then all of a sudden this guy just kind of like blurts out and just like interrupts him. And so listen to what happens in starting in verse 13. He says, someone in the crowd said to him, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And Jesus replied, man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter between you? I just love this answer. I just think this whole thing is funny. And I think you have to think a little bit about like who Jesus was in that culture, right? He didn't have any official capacity. He wasn't even kind of an official rabbi. He was kind of a self-made rabbi, but he had so much like authority from God. Like when he taught, people are like, oh, that like, people are like, something's up, like something's serious about this guy. I'm going to listen to him. And so he just kind of had just the authority that he exuded, but he didn't have any position. He couldn't rubber stamp something and say, well, okay, let's look at the inheritance and we're going to divide it up. And, this is how it's going to, he didn't have any authority to do something like that. This is just a PR move. This guy is just saying, lots of people like to listen to this guy. We got a crowd gathered around from the village here. And if I can get this guy that people like to listen to say, yeah, your brother's being greedy, he should split the inheritance with you, it's going to put a lot of peer pressure on it. That's all. And I love Jesus' response. He's like, excuse me, what business of that is that of mine? Like, I don't understand. Like, and you would think that Jesus is done. Like he's teaching, he's saying something important, eternal life, something great, and he's, just giving this amazing information. And this guy interrupts him and then he just says, what does that have to do with me? And you think he just turned right back to teaching, but he doesn't. Listen to what he says in verse 15. He said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And it's like, okay, I don't think that this guy was expecting that. Like he was hoping he'd call his brother out. He kind of called him out. He kind of said, oh, I see what it's all about for you. It's all about money, even more than your relationship with your brother. And you need to be real careful about all kinds of greed, sir. I don't think that was the result he was hoping for. And I love this. He says, be careful about all kinds of greed. Why does he say all kinds of greed? That is another thing that cracks me up about the Bible. Sometimes, Paul will say, or, watch out for all forms of malice. And I'm like, I'm gonna sit down and make a list of all forms of malice. Like malice. I can only think of one form. So like all forms of greed. Like what is that? What does that mean? All forms. Well, here's what's so interesting about that. There are all kinds of ways to be greedy, and you know what? They look so different that you would say, oh, well, that's not greed. Here's what I mean by that. Like, and here's what's funny. We're judgmental about the other type, aren't we? So here's what I mean. So if you're struggling just to get by, you look at somebody who is doing well in life and you say, if I had that much money, I'd be making more of a difference. Now, of course, you don't know. You don't know what this person does. This person may be doing all kinds of wonderful things, but you're assuming that their assumption is all for their consumption. And so you're saying, if I had that much money, I'd be making a difference in the world. That person is greedy. But I'm not greedy. Now, the reason I don't have that kind of money is because I don't manage my money as well as they do, and I'm so greedy that I spend everything I have on myself and more. But they're greedy. Or somebody who saves a lot, can look at somebody who is deep in debt and go, well, you shouldn't have been greedy. So it's just funny. We don't think that what we're doing is greed, but we think that what the person on the other end of the spectrum is doing is greed. And so we all kind of are judgmental about the person who has the other type of greed. And so, again, you would think Jesus is done here, right? I mean, good night. Look at what he said. I mean, watch out, be on guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. Man, I mean, you could sit and think about that all day long. So I guess he's going to get back to his teaching. No, he launches into a story here, a parable. It's what the stories of Jesus are called. And he says, the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. Now, first of all, I just want to say this before we read this last part of the verse here, is I think it's funny how much this guy's talking to himself, but then he actually plans what he's going to talk to himself in the next verse, which I think that's funny. And then he says, and then I will say to myself. So you ever plan that? 2 weeks from now, I'll tell you what I'm going to say to myself. But okay. And he says, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. What happened here? Greed slipped into the planning meeting. You got too much grain. You can't store it. Well, you better have a meeting with yourself. And this guy's doing a great job of having a meeting with himself. Phenomenal job of having a meeting with himself. And so, you can't just let it sit out there and rot, right? So you got to have a meeting. Okay, great. Planning meeting. Greed slips in. And all of a sudden, something's happening. But at this point, I think most of the people in the crowd would go, I don't see where greed has slipped into the planning meeting here. I don't see a problem. This guy's just figuring out what's he going to do with having too much grain. Like anybody would have to figure that out. And so I think it shocked a lot of people when we get to verse 20, and Jesus takes this turn. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? Do you see it? Do you see how greed got into the planning meeting? Do you see it here from what Jesus said? Some people would look at this and say, well, the problem that Jesus had with it is this guy has so much and a lot of people don't. And that's not right. And Jesus never condemns or has a problem with the fact that people achieve at different levels. That's not the issue. The issue is that as greed slips in, he says to himself, I've got so much on my hands, I need to find a way to store it. Okay, that's great. You need to have that meeting. But then it slips in and it says, dude, you are so set for life. Look at what you're going to be able to do with all this. That is great that you are storing it up. And the key is the last two words. For yourself. It's the assumption that it's all for your consumption. That's the problem. That's where things went off the rails. It's all here for me to consume. Never asking, why did God bless me with so much? What does God want me to do with all that he has given me? What are God's priorities and how I handle what he has provided? God, show me what the needs are around me. There's none of that's on the table here in the planning meeting, right? It's just for yourself. And then Jesus says, this is how it's going to be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Now, I don't think that means that everybody who gets greedy today is going to die tonight. Hopefully you're happy to hear that. I don't think that means that. If you go to lunch and you split a sandwich with your wife and you look and go, this one looks like the bigger half. Boom, you're gone. Yeah, you should have been more generous. I don't think that's what that means, but I think that a really good picture of that is what Jesus said in Matthew 16:26. He said, what good would it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul. I mean, just that concept that I can pursue all of this, and this can be what life is about. But in the end, I'm not going to have life. In the end, I'm going to have exchanged my life for something that was worthless. And I think that's what Jesus is saying. And so Jesus says, instead of doing what this guy did, we should be rich toward God. What does that mean? Like, that's a concept that's like, well, how do I wrap my head around that? And I think we're going to see some really clear things from what Paul says here in just a second, but I think it just means seeking first his kingdom, his priorities, his agenda, his plans. I think we need to kick greed out of the planning meeting and put God back in charge of it. I think it means being more focused on knowing God intimately than we are the things that we have our eye on. I think it means laying up treasure in heaven. It means finding your meaning and your identity in Jesus and not in money. Money and the things it can buy are not the meaning of life, Jesus says. They can at times provide a means to something, but they're not the meaning. Jesus tells this guy, life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. Sometimes we literally act like the next thing that we're looking for or we're hoping for or we're wanting, that like we have to have that like we have to have air. Like, don't we? Like, I mean, it's just like we're so desperate for it. And we just kind of have these standards in culture, and you can kind of see that when certain things come up. Like, for instance, if you carry like an iPhone that's like 4 generations ago, like, first of all, every time you get it out, I feel like you have to apologize to everybody around you. Right? You know, I know a button. Who needs a button? I know. I've got a face. Why do I need a button? I get it. Like, or other people are kind of looking at you like, oh, an iPhone 6. Like, oh, and it's like literally, like we find status in those kind of things. Like, isn't that crazy? Like we act like, oh, I've got to have that. I've got to have that. Or we use phrases, and this is sad. I mean, I just literally heard somebody say this the other day to me. What do you think he's worth? That's a terrible question. I mean, the answer should be the blood of Jesus, by the way, every single time. But that's not what we mean, is it? We mean how much money does that guy have? How much money does that lady have? I mean, like, really, that's a terrible question. That's what you're worth? That's not what you're worth. That's a terrible question. And yet that's what we talk about in our culture. How sad is it to base your identity or your worth on something that you will lose 100% of? I love this question that Jesus asked, and literally I think that he just kills the guy in the illustration just so he can ask it. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And the answer 100% of the time is somebody else, not you. 100% of the time. It's going to be somebody else. You don't get to keep it. And so what are we going to do about this issue? I think that Paul gives us some really great advice in 1 Timothy chapter 6. And here's what I want to say about this. Let's just make this our focus all the time, because we don't know when greed has taken over the planning meeting. We don't know. We're not smart enough to realize it. Again, the intention sounds so good. Well, let's plan. Let's think this through. It just makes so much sense. Yeah, that's a great idea. I need to think about that. Yeah, and we don't even realize, greed took over. We don't even realize. So let's just make these things our habit. And listen to what Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 6. First of all, he just finished talking about people who think that godliness is a means to financial gain. Literally, that the more godly you are, the more rich you're going to be. Not that anybody teaches that. But that's what he's saying. And he turns in verse 6 and he says, but godliness with contentment, that's what great gain is. That's what a full life is. That's what it looks like. That focusing on godliness and being content, man, that's the life. That's what you should be focused on. He says, for we brought nothing into this world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Then he says, those who want to get rich. So, does that mean, those who work hard and, hope to, plan for the future and that kind of, no, this is their goal. Their goal is they're focused on that. Basically, we could just replace that with those who are greedy, those who have the assumption that it's all for their consumption, fall into a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires, and they plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. I hate to break it to our ancestors, but one translation is a fantastic translation, but misses right there. Like it says, the love of money is the root of all evil. But and this is super accurate right here. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. People do all kinds of evil for money. And it says, some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. So Paul basically kind of gives us three important, I don't want to say steps because I'm going to make the point in a second that they're not linear, okay? But he gives us three important keys, I think, here for what we should be focusing on to make sure that we're not sitting in a planning meeting with ourselves one day and greed comes in and takes over. And here's the first one he says is godliness. We tend to think that some people are just more godly than others. Like it's like some passive characteristic. Like, you know, some people that you just feel like, well, they're just close to God. Like, I think it's just an accident. I think God just likes them extra special, you know. But that's not what godliness is. Godliness is just the pursuit of God, right? It's just seeking him and his kingdom first. It's investing in your relationship with God as your first priority. And until we really value knowing God and living for God over everything else, there's the chance that money slips in and takes over, that greed slips in and takes over. Now listen, like this concept of godliness and focusing on your relationship with God and making that the priority, like it starts with knowing God, right? And so as we say this all the time in our messages is like God gives us all kinds of practical advice for how to live out the Christian life, but it all comes in the context of knowing him and the Holy Spirit helping us live it out. It's impossible to do without him. And so like it starts with having that relationship with God. And so it doesn't start with like, oh, I'm going to try to follow some of this and I'm going to hope that God will be more impressed with me because I'm following stuff he wrote down. That's not where it starts. It starts with saying, God, like, listen, my first step of breaking greed is going to say, I'm going to give away how I think I should run my life, and I'm going to hand it over to Jesus Christ because he has shown himself so worthy because he came and he died on a cross for my sins, gave his life, rose from the dead to prove that he's God and prove that my sins are dealt with. And so therefore he's so worthy of all my trust that I'm going to hand my life over to him. It starts there. That's how you start your pursuit of godliness. But then after you begin that relationship, it's just constantly focusing on his kingdom first and that relationship first. It's got to start there. Paul says godliness with contentment, that's what great gain is. And so that's what we need to focus on. The second thing is contentment. Again, we think this is a passive characteristic. Like some of you, you've raised several different kids, and like some of them are super content, and some of us are just like, like always envying and frustrated and always want what somebody else has, and they're just never content, And so you just think, oh, it just comes naturally to some people. But really, contentment is just the result of thankfulness, praise, and gratitude. Constantly focusing on how good God is. And when we're intentional to spend time thanking God for what he is giving us, and praising him because he's our provider and acknowledging that we can trust him, even if at the moment things don't look great, we become more content. And we take our eyes off what we don't have and we put it on what we do have. And it's going to help give us more and more of a heart of worship. You can't envy and worship at the same time. And so as we just continue to focus on contentment, what happens is it breaks that greed in our lives. Not that we don't ever have any aspirations or anything, but that we know that if we have those basics, and that if God has been good enough to take care of those basics. And in the passage he says just food and clothing. And I would probably throw shelter in there, but you just got those, those three basic things that you're like, okay, I'm good. Like I don't have to feel like I need a little bit more to feel like that I'm something different or I'm something better or I'm more impressive. And the third thing is just lay up treasure in heaven. You say, well, Jim, Paul didn't say that in the passage you read so far, and you're right. He says it just a little bit further down, starting in verse 17. He says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant or to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. And he says, but they should put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. And I love that sentence, for our enjoyment. Like God wants us to enjoy, right? And he says, command them to do good and to be rich in good deeds. Rich in good deeds. Well, that's interesting. Like rich toward God. Like, okay. And to be generous and willing to share. And in this way, they will lay up treasure. Listen, first of all, the Bible fits together unbelievably. When you really get into the Bible, you're like, wow. Like this, all of this. You look at like we've got lay up treasure. Jesus talked about that. We've got about the fact that 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 they should command them to be rich in good deeds. You got Jesus saying rich toward God. Like so much of all of this just fits together unbelievably. And he says, lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Now, first of all, he says, command those who are rich. We out, right? That's not us, right? That's not us. No. So I'm glad Paul is telling Timothy to get after those people, right? But most of us we'd have to be very, very rich before we walked around saying, yeah, that's me, right? I mean, like as Rockefeller said, just a little bit more, and then I would say, yeah, I'm pretty rich, right? And so we have a hard time with that. But listen, historically, throughout all of time, what rich really is people who have extra. People who have just a little bit more than what they need. And again, we don't feel that way, right? And why don't we feel that way? We don't feel that way because greed slipped into the planning meeting and said it's all for your consumption. And so we handled our finances in such a way that put us in a position where we don't have any more money at the end of the month. But do we have extra? Well, if we've ever traded in a phone that was working just fine for one that we like better, that costs us more, yes, we do. If we've ever traded in a car that was working just fine for one that we like better, yes, we do. I felt like literally, you wouldn't believe the conversation Lori and I had about trading in our 2007 Honda Odyssey with 225,000 miles on it. We were like, but it still works. But I just had this feeling, not much longer. So I was just like, yeah, I think it's okay at this point. But but it still works, And so and man, like people make fun of minivans, but I'm just going to tell you, like you can transport a ton of people. You got an indoor truck. I mean, you got life. I mean, it's awesome. But anyhow, yeah. Now I'm preaching. Listen, if the question is not if you'll eat today, but where you'll eat today, you have extra. If you've got streaming services galore, you have extra. And many people on the planet, even today, don't have the luxury of making those decisions, those types of decisions that a lot of us are able to make. But look at what Paul tells us. He says, first, tell them not to be arrogant and put their hope in wealth. Man, that is just so close to what Jesus said, right? When he says, life is not in your possessions. It's not about the abundant. Don't put your hope in that. It certainly doesn't make us better than anyone else. And then Paul says, instead of that, put your hope in God, because we can trust him to provide. And then he says, tell them to be rich in good deeds and generous and willing to share. Both of those things, really, really important. Rich in good deeds and generous and willing to share. The thing that breaks greed or selfishness, which is basically the same thing, is pouring ourselves out to serve and love other people. And whether that's through serving, through good works, or whether that is through giving. And he lists both of them. And again, I want to point out that we struggle to see where we're challenged in one of those categories. In other words, if you're doing well financially, it's no big deal for you if Justin says, hey, like we'd like to help this family, and you say, oh, well, I'm just going to jump in, I'm going to help, and I can help significantly. But if we said, hey, we would love for you to come and maybe go down to Rise Up and help us with a ministry down there on a weeknight, you would say, do you know what my time is worth? Like, no, I can't be doing that. Or if we said, hey, can you come and begin to get involved with some of our students on Wednesday night because it's just exploding and we need more and more people, or in our children's ministry, we need, we could use some more help to pour into people and serve people and raise up not future leaders, but leaders right now out of that generation. And you say, I don't really think that I got time for that. That's not really that important, but I give. But then you got the flip side, right? You got people who are always willing to serve, and that comes naturally to them, and they feel like they have that and they can do that. But things are tight. Do they have extra? Yeah, they have extra, but things are tight. And when you say, hey, can let's make a difference. Like let's invest in the work that God is doing through Northridge. Let's invest in this need that we've come across overseas or here in the community. And we say, yeah, I don't think I can do that. I think it's important when you look at those two things and the importance of breaking greed in your life when it comes to pouring into other people personally and serving them, and when it comes to giving. I think it's important to challenge yourself in the one that doesn't come easily to you. I think it's important to push yourself on that. And so Paul says that when we do that, we actually take hold of the life that is truly life. Again, look how these things fit together. Like Jesus says, life is not about the abundance of your possessions. And Paul turns around and says, this is life that is truly life. When you're investing in other people and you're being generous and you're pouring yourself out and you're content, and you're pursuing godliness first and foremost, that is life that is truly life. It's awesome. And so you can start anywhere in these 3 steps. You can start anywhere. In trying to break greed, you can start anywhere. But I just think it's interesting that Jesus says something in Matthew 6:21 that some of you may feel like, hey, I don't know that I feel very content right now, but I kind of feel like I'm pursuing God, but I don't really know. But one step that you can for sure do that can kind of push you in that direction, Jesus says in Matthew 6:21. Here's what he says. He says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Now, Jesus, you said that backwards because I think it's where your heart is, what you care about, then you'll invest in. Jesus says, no. So, we get it wrong sometimes. We think that our feelings drive what we do. And he says a lot of times what we do will drive our feelings. And so where your treasure is, where you have gone to the trouble to put your treasure, your heart will follow. Now, this is true. By the way, you've experienced this, I've experienced this in all kinds of ways. We have experienced this type of thing, right? Like if you've ever said, man, I feel like I ought to give towards a compassion child. I should do that. Other people are doing it. I'm at this concert. I'm at this service. They're standing in the aisles waving this picture of this kid. And I feel like I should do that, But you don't really have any heart for it. But you just kind of feel like, I guess I should do that. You do it, and then all of a sudden your family falls in love with this kid, falls in love. You can't wait to write the next letter. Like you're passionate about it now. You're telling other people, have you ever sponsored a compassion child? You should really sponsor a compassion child. I mean, it is life-changing. Not interesting. Some of you, mission trip, right? Like at some point you're like, I guess at some point, I'm like, I guess I should go on a mission trip. And maybe you even thought, it'll be a cool experience. It'll be a cool experience. Like, oh, here's one that's like, oh, this one's in the Caribbean. Sign me up, right? And so you go, right? That's how Chris ended up in Belize. No, I'm just kidding. God led him there. But you go, and what are you doing? You're paying money. You're losing vacation time. You go there and you invest in the people, and all of a sudden, what happens? You care about that like crazy, right? I mean, you all know some of you know the story of Shrimp Matters with Jeremy Wainwright at our Irwin campus. He just went. He's like, I've never flown anywhere. I've never been on an airplane in my life. Think I'll go to Honduras with John Oakley. Comes back, starts a whole foundation so that he can just completely revolutionize the culture there because he so loves it now. He put some treasure there, and now he's passionate about it. I've sent both. I've literally paid my last payment for my last kid in college, and they both went to the same place. We've been there for 8 years. I have sent my flesh and blood. That is my treasure. I have sent a ton of my treasure. You know what I do now? I'm on Instagram and I'm like, woohoo, golf team won. Yes, I like that. I don't care about golf. I don't care, but I'm a huge fan now. Why? Because I sent all my treasure, all of it, Everything I have but my wife. I didn't send her. I sent it all. And so I'm passionate about it now. Isn't that interesting? See, we think, well, when I get passionate, then I'll invest. And Jesus says, no, you invest, and it will drive you to start pursuing godliness. It will drive you to be more content as you begin to invest. Some of you, you've had a relationship with God for a long time, and things have just been stale. And maybe this is the moment. Maybe this is the time for you to step into that, to say, you know what, I want to be rich toward God. I want to invest in other people. I want to serve other people. I want to be generous to what God is doing in our community, through our church, wherever God shows me. I want to be a generous person. Maybe this is the moment to be intentional about where your treasure goes so that your heart will begin to follow. And you'll begin to see something amazing happen in your life. You'll begin to experience contentment. You'll begin to be walking with God like you never have. You'll be making a difference in other people's lives. And you'll say, this is a life that is truly life.